The sun rose over a scenery of blood and gore in Jerusalem on the 13th of July, 1099. For more than a month, the city, holy to Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike, had been besieged by a Crusader army. At first, the Fatimid defenders were quite confident, but now 2 enormous siege engines stood in front of their walls. A massive ram was battering against the defenses, and clouds of arrows were raining down on the city. Just behind the siege engines, an army of 12,000 Crusaders was eagerly waiting to charge the sturdy defenses of Jerusalem. The final assault was just about to begin. This video doesn't include an ad read. Instead, you'll see gameplay footage of Knights of Honor 2 Sovereign from time to time. So thanks to THQ Nordic for sponsoring the video in such an unintrusive way. In 1095, Pope Urban II proclaimed a crusade. His rousing calls for a holy war were allegedly echoed by the motto of the Crusades, Deus lo vult, God wills it. Only later, this would be shortened to the more famous version Deus vult. Soon, a large expeditionary force known as the People's Crusade, led by the charismatic preacher Peter the Hermit, flocked together and marched towards Asia Minor. After crossing the Bosporus, they were defeated in a battle near Nicaea and scattered. Peter's expeditionary force was followed by 6 armies. They were led by princes from France, Normandy, Flanders, Provence, Lorraine, and southern Italy. Their rallying point was Constantinople, from where they wanted to wage war against the Seljuks. Marching to Constantinople across the green meadows of the Balkans was easy, and it was a good moment to attack the Seljuks. Internal quarrels divided them so that they disregarded the world beyond their own borders. The power of the, for once, united European knights might catch them on the wrong foot. The European armies were, according to the historian Christopher Tyerman, collectively dubbed Franks by the sources. They arrived at the Byzantine capital between November 1096 and June 1097. Despite ongoing difficulties to agree on one leader, the Crusader armies, who numbered about 50 to 70,000 men, crossed the Bosporus, captured Nicaea, the capital of the Seljuks, and marched across Asia Minor, and defeated the Seljuks in the Battle of Dorylaeum. After the battle, they continued their advance towards Syria. At this point, tensions among the Crusaders as leaders escalated, and one of their leaders, Baldwin of Boulogne, and his men left the main army. While they entered Armenia and captured Edessa, the bulk of the Crusaders turned south and laid siege to Antioch. After capturing it and defending it against a huge relief army from Mosul, they stayed in Syria, squabbling over the spoils and living off the land until January 1099. Throughout this time, zealous preachers and reports of miracles fostered the sense of being an instrument of divine providence in the army. When they finally marched through the dry lands of the Levante toward Jerusalem, the men were filled with a spirit of pious determination. The Crusaders approached the city from the northwest along the Jaffa Road. By nightfall on Tuesday, the 7th of June, they were encamped before the Holy City. According to the historian Thomas Asbridge, they numbered some 12,000 to 13,000 fighting men, of which about 1,200 to 1,300 were knights. Still, any strategist less certain of divine support would have hesitated before attempting to attack Jerusalem at that moment. The city was a renowned fortress, held by the powerful Fatimid Caliphate. Its walls were in good condition, and its eastern and southern side were protected by steep ravines. It was only approachable from 2 sides, the southwestern corner and the northern side, where the fortifications were even stronger. The quadrangular tower and the citadel near the Jaffa Gate dominated a line of defenses consisting of a massive inner wall, and for much of the approachable sides, a lower wall and a ditch. Apart from this, the Fatimid governor Iftikhar ad-Dawla had prepared the city well. He had a numerous garrison of Arab and Sudanese troops. The cisterns of the city were filled to the brim, and supplies and stocks from the surrounding area had been brought inside the walls. The precautious leader he was, he had also reinforced the defenses and expelled all Christians and heretics. He didn't want to risk a disaster like in Antioch. where a traitor had helped the Crusaders in. This expulsion also reduced the mouths to feed significantly and deprived attackers of the possibility to forage nearby. To the same end, the Fatimids had poisoned all wells in the vicinity. So, when the first knights were spotted by his scouts, Iftikhar ad-Dawla was confident he could hold out. And he knew he wouldn't need to stand strong forever. A relief army from Egypt was already on its way. The prospects of the attackers stood in stark contrast to the formidable situation of the defenders. Basically, they were short of everything, from numbers to supplies to arms. Almost from the beginning of the siege, the shortage of water and food in the region forced foraging parties to travel 6 miles or more to get water from safe springs. They were exposed to attacks from the city's garrison, who had assigned 400 elite light cavalrymen with the task of harassing them. The Crusaders were in a difficult situation, to say the least. They had to take the city as quickly as possible. Because of the terrain, the best, or rather only place to try an assault was the northern wall. Accordingly, the princes took up positions. With limited supplies, the situation was about to turn sour quickly. So the princes decided to go on a pilgrimage to the Mount of Olives on the 12th of June. There, an aged hermit allegedly advised them to attack the walls on the next morning, promising victory through God's aid. While this story is probably a literary justification for the things to come, it was mainly the difficult situation that prompted the Crusaders to attack right away, as the expert for the First Crusade, John France, explains. Due to their numbers, it was impossible to lay siege to the town properly. When stretched out to the max, their troops probably only covered about 1 kilometer of the wall, which is not even the whole northern side. Because of this, a quick and decisive general assault was their best shot. At dawn of the next day, the Crusader army lined up for battle just outside the reach of the archers on the walls. Suddenly, commands and drums sounded through the air, and under the humming of hundreds of arrows, a clamoring mass of Crusaders threw itself against the defenses of Jerusalem, just east of the quadrangular tower. The Fatimids, aware of their superior position, awaited them on the walls and pelted them with projectiles of all sorts, as they came within reach. To protect themselves, the Crusaders immediately formed a tortoise by interlocking their shields. Their attack was fervent, so fervent in fact that the Crusaders managed to cross the ditch and storm the outer, smaller wall. Allegedly, they even put up some ladders against the inner wall. After several hours of struggling, and with heavy losses, however, they still couldn't make it up and had to retreat. The princes had learned their lesson. In a council of war on the 15th of June, they agreed on a more tactically sound approach, and constructed more siege equipment, namely projectile throwers, rams, and siege towers, for their next attempt. Unfortunately, they were also short of building materials, so only few projectiles were hurled at the wall at this stage of the siege. Little suitable wood was found within a reasonable distance. The hills around Jerusalem were treeless, and the few groves had been cleared by the Fatimids. But then, only 2 days later, a messenger brought news. 6 Christian ships had arrived at the harbor of Jaffa, a nearby port abandoned by the Muslims. They brought food, water, and the much-needed ropes, nails, and skilled woodworkers. Immediately, a major force was sent to get supplies from the ships and protect the sailors. But the ships were noticed by the nearby Egyptian fleet, and the preparations on land to collect the cargo hadn't gone unnoticed either. The escort was ambushed by Fatimid troops in what was the biggest open field struggle during the siege. The Crusaders were separated in 2 or 3 groups, and only by the skin of their teeth did they manage to fend off the numerically superior attackers. In the meantime, the Egyptian fleet installed a sea blockade around Jaffa and trapped all but one of the European ships in the harbor. Seeing this, the sailors quickly landed the cargo, removed whatever wood they could use from the ships, and then set them aflame. According to John France, this was decisive in providing material, especially heavy structural timber and skilled woodworkers, but also demonstrated the isolation of the Crusader force and its vulnerability, as it was standing before Jerusalem. Still, there was not enough wood yet, so that the expeditions were sent long distances to collect the needed quantities. At last, two of the Crusaders' leaders, Robert of Flanders and Tancred, reached the forests of Samaria about 65 miles north of Jerusalem. By enslaving large numbers of the local population, they finally managed to bring back planks and beams. The construction of the much-needed engines could begin, after all. Conditions in the Crusader camp worsened quickly. Water became a real problem, because the needs of a large army that was working hard in the heat of the Mediterranean sun were enormous. And the Crusaders often had to travel as far as the Jordan River to get enough water. Soon, pack animals started to die of thirst, the condition of the men deteriorated, and their leaders began to quarrel again. They bickered over the future of Jerusalem, because many knights desired to see a king for Palestine, while others and all the clergy declared that no man should call himself king in the city where Christ was crowned. In early June, news that a relief army was closing in and would reach Jerusalem in less than a month brought the morale to its low point. What lowered the morale of the attackers encouraged the defenders. They were still well provisioned, and the news of the coming army to them was a reason to cheer. Still, they remained on guard, and when they saw the two nascent towers, began to reinforce the defenses with beams, padding, stockpiled ammunition, and ropes near the threatened sections. Soon, Ad-Dawla was satisfied with the preparations. When despair was close, a ritualistic moment changed everything in the Christian camp. On the morning of the 6th of July, an assembly decided to organize a fast and solemn procession around the city walls, strangely recalling that of Joshua at the biblical town of Jericho. The defenders watched in derision as they saw the whole army walking along their walls barefooted 2 days later. The procession culminated in a series of sermons on the Mount of Olives and gave the morale of the troops a tremendous boost. And, if the sources are to be trusted, this single-handedly united the quarreling leaders of the Crusader army. Whatever the reasons were, the princes finally acted in concert, and the desperate soldiers pulled together their last strength. Every available hand helped prepare the assault and the construction of the siege towers. Reportedly, even children and grandmothers helped sewing hides to towers and rams, so that finally, despite all hardship, the siege equipment was ready. In the night of the 9th to the 10th of July, movement arose in the northern camp of the Crusaders. Workers silently dismantled the siege tower built by Godfrey's camp close to the quadrangular tower and transported it to a flat spot about 150 meters east of Herod's Gate, a sector previously deliberately ignored to deceive the Fatimids. When the sun rose on the 10th of July, the Fatimids, who had watched the construction of the tower with anxiety, were in shock when they found it no longer where they had prepared for it, but in a spot they had been neglecting. Their careful preparations had all been in vain. The governor immediately ordered every hand in the city to strengthen the defenses, and any battle-ready man to the walls, frantically trying to correct the fatal mistake. In a prolonged council of war some weeks ago, the Crusaders had decided on a two-pronged attack, whose focal points were defined by the position of the two siege towers. However, before effective action could begin, the ditch had to be filled in, the northern tower reassembled, and the outer wall cleared. This was a lot of hard and dangerous work. Thanks to the successful deception, there was only little and improvised resistance in the north, so that the besiegers had the terrain properly prepared after just 1 day. Now they set up a huge ram and large mangonels to clear the battlements and tear down the outer wall. On the 13th of July, the assault proper began. As the ram was advancing, the Fatimids tried to steady the flame. Their archers sent clouds of arrows down on the attackers, who answered in kind. A savage battle for the outer wall ensued and went on for almost 2 days before the attackers succeeded. The ram broke through. But now they were facing another problem. The ram, useless against the sturdy main wall, barred the way for the siege tower, and there was not enough space to move it aside. In the end, the knights resolved to what the defenders had tried in vain. They set the ram aflame. Ironically, roles had changed, and the defenders tried to put it out by pouring water on it. When the ram was finally reduced to ashes on the 15th of July, the Crusaders hauled the siege tower forward. This in itself was an enormous task. While archers on top tried to suppress enemy fire from the walls, the massive construction, about 15 meters high, was pushed and hauled forward inch by inch. All the while, the defenders had installed 5 mangonels, which battered against the structure and tried to set it afire, using, among other things, Greek fire, the infamous incendiary of the Middle Ages. Although the use of incendiaries in siege warfare was very rare in general, it is possible that the notion of Greek fire in the sources refers to hand grenades filled with inflammable liquid. According to DeVries, an expert on medieval military technology, such weapons were indeed used by the Muslim armies at the time. In the end, however, the attackers fended off all attempts on the tower. Damaged, but still functional, it was finally hauled all the way up to the wall. In the meantime, things were not going well for the Crusaders on the southern side of the city. There was even less room there because of the terrain. In addition, the resistance of the defenders was fierce. They were well prepared and commanded by the governor himself, so that it took the attackers 3 days to fill in the ditch and the tower could advance only in the evening of the 14th. All the while, the Crusaders were met with fiery weapons of all kinds, stones hurled from 9 mangonels and countless smaller projectiles. They struggled to keep up the pressure, and by midday of the 15th of July, they were seriously considering retreat. Raymond's men had suffered tremendous casualties. Their own camp was set on fire and their siege tower was damaged so severely it had to be withdrawn. It was only thanks to encouraging messages from the northern side that they kept struggling. Unfortunately, much less is known about this venue. At some point, however, the odds must have changed. While the Crusaders in the south still struggled with the well-prepared and coordinated defense, those in the north finally pushed through. Although the sources give contradicting information about how the Crusaders made it to the wall, it is certain that a handful of them did. Soon, Godfrey joined them. Immediately, the Fatimids rushed in to push them back over the battlements, but the knights resisted long enough for others to follow. When they had cleaned out a section of the wall, numerous scaling ladders were put in place and more of Godfrey's men climbed up. While they were fighting along the walls to open the gate of the column for the rest of the army, Tancred and his men entered the streets and pushed towards the temple area. Meanwhile, the defenders barely managed to keep their organization intact and were finally pushed to the southwestern corner where Ad-Dawla saw his defense disintegrate. He had been forced to retire to the citadel near the Jaffa gate. In late afternoon, when he saw that his men were in a pinch, he offered negotiations. In exchange for safe conduct, he handed over all the treasures stored in the tower. Raymond accepted, occupied the tower, and provided an escort for the Fatimid governor. By the evening of the 15th of July, the Crusaders had taken possession of the whole of Jerusalem. In a military sense, the siege was over. But now began the massacre. Iftikhar ad-Dawla and his bodyguards were lucky to make it out of the holy city alive. As Crusaders now swept through the streets and houses, plundering, raping, and killing indiscriminately. The usual brutality of a sack was amplified by the hatred and wrath of the men who had been put through enormous sufferings in the past years. When the carnage ended, the streets were littered with bodies and running with blood. So dark a tragedy was this massacre that even Western observers choose the vocabulary of apocalypse to describe it. Yet despite this shocking end, the conquest of Jerusalem awed Christendom, and for generations, no event would even remotely rival the impact and memory of the First Crusade. Thanks again to THQ Nordic and Knights of Honor 2 Sovereign for sponsoring this video. We've put about 15 to 20 hours into the game by the time this video goes live. It's good fun. Check it out via the link in the description box below. It helps out our channel tremendously if you do so, because we might land another deal with THQ Nordic in the future.